Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jae-Jae Spoon, and I'm a professor of political science and director of the Center for European Studies here at Pitt. Welcome to this month's conversation on Europe, which is part of our Year of Creating Europe series, as well as Pitt's German Campus Week. Today's topic is cultural diversity and inclusive community building in Germany, and builds on our conversation last month, which focused on the EU's motto of United in Diversity. You will have the opportunity to ask questions using the chat or Q&A function located at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to pose a question at any time during the discussion, and I will try to get to as many of these as I can. Today's conversation is sponsored by the European Studies Center, the University Center for International Studies, and the German Department. It is co-funded by the Erasmus Program of the European Union. Our co-sponsors today are the Jean Monnet Center of Excellence at Florida International University, the European Union Center at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, and the Jean Monnet Center of Excellence at the University of Florida. To learn more about our future conversations on Europe and programming we are doing with other EU-funded institutions in the US this year through the hashtag Jean Monnet in the USA initiative, actually JM in the USA initiative, please visit our website, and one of my colleagues will put that in the chat. I want to thank several of my colleagues, Iris Matievich, Alison Delnor, and Kenny Riley at the European Studies Center for their help in organizing today's event. Now, to get us started, 30 years after reunification, Germany's population and society has become increasingly more diverse. According to the German Statistical Office, in 2019, of Germany's 83 million people, nearly 28% have a migrant background, which means that an individual has at least one parent who did not acquire German citizenship by birth. And 13% are foreign-born, with the largest groups coming from Poland, Turkey, and Syria. 58 members of the German parliament, the Bundestag, have a migrant background, which corresponds to about 8% of members of parliament. According to the OECD, the female employment rate in Germany is 70%, which is over 10% higher than the OECD average, largely in part of the legacy of the GDR, one could argue. Although the gender pay gap is 17%, which is higher than the OECD average. Women make up 30.9% of members in parliament today. Since January 2016, 30% of supervisory board positions must be filled by women. Same-sex marriage was legalized in Germany in 2017, though same-sex partnerships have been legally recognized since 2001. In 2017, a law was passed to give same-sex couples full adoption rights. The General Act on Equal Treatment, passed in 2006, bans discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity in employment, education, health services, and the provision of goods and services. To put these statistics into context and further discuss their implications, cultural diversity, and inclusive community building in Germany, I am joined today by several experts, which I would now like to introduce. First, we have Danny Choi, who is Assistant Professor of Political Science at the University of Pittsburgh. His work focuses on democratic representation and identity politics. With co-authors, he has published 2 articles on discrimination against immigrants, which are part of a larger book project under contract with Princeton University Press, entitled Norms, Ideas, and Identities: Overcoming Discrimination Against Immigrants, which examines the extent to which common norms, identities, and ideas can reduce prejudice and discrimination against immigrants and ultimately facilitate their inclusion in democratic polities. And it specifically looks at Germany. Before coming to Pitt, Danny was a postdoctoral fellow at the Identity and Conflict Lab at the University of Pennsylvania. Next, I'm pleased to welcome Rahsaan Maxwell, who is Professor of Political Science at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. His research focuses on how national boundaries operate, and specifically on questions of immigrant integration, political representation, identity, and political behavior, primarily in Western Europe. His recent work focuses on urban-rural divides, cultural diversity, globalization, and national culture. He has recently published Cosmopolitan Immigration Attitudes in Large European Cities, Contextual or Compositional Effects, in the American Political Science Review, which examines why people in large cities are more likely to have favorable opinions about immigration, and looks specifically at Switzerland and Germany. Next, I'm pleased to welcome Kai Unzicker, who is Senior Project Manager at the Bertelsmann Foundation, where he is responsible for the topics of social cohesion. Since 2011, he has been using the Social Cohesion Radar to examine how community life in Germany and in international comparison has changed. He is one of the spokespersons of the Alliance for Social Cohesion, an alliance of 10 foundations whose work focuses on social cohesion in Germany in various ways. In 2018, he was project manager of the Reinhard Mohn Prize on the topic Living Diversity Shaping Society. Before joining the Bertelsmann Foundation, he worked as a postdoctoral researcher at the Institute for Interdisciplinary Conflict and Violence Research at the University of Bielefeld. And we have a fourth panelist who will be joining us a bit later, who I will introduce when she joins us. So welcome to everyone, and I look forward to a wonderful conversation. To start, I'd like for us to discuss what diversity is more generally, and the different perspectives on that. So I think, Kai, I will turn that to you to start.
Thank you. And first of all, thank you for the invitation. I'm very happy to be with you all here. And it's a big question. What is diversity? And first of all, it's a very broad concept that it could range from age to gender, disability, ethnic origin, religion, sexual orientation, sexual identity. But when I talk about diversity, or what I use as a concept of diversity in my work is a more narrow concept. It's focusing on cultural diversity. So in general, I focus on immigration and religion. But perhaps another point when we talk about diversity is a distinction I use, and I hope this distinction works in English as well as in German. While diversity represents the factual differences in a society, the factual differences between people, I use pluralism as the normative attitude towards this diversity. So you could say a society is diverse in one way or the other, but if the people in the country do not accept this diversity or even consciously reject it, then this country or this society would be not pluralistic in that sense. So that's a thing. So for me, diversity is a very neutral term, and yeah, that's a special thing. So and if you now have a look on Germany, perhaps. You could say that the country is now diverse for a very long time, more or less for the last six decades, but it has only recently become a pluralistic in a way, so that that the people in the country recognize the diversity and have a positive attitudes towards this diversity in the society.
Great, thank you. No, I think that's an important distinction to make between diversity and pluralism as well, not just the numbers, for example, that I sort of gave out at the beginning, but again, sort of what that reaction is among the individuals in society. Perhaps we can kind of make a tour of that same question and see what others have to say about sort of that definition of diversity. Rahsaan, do you want to jump in?
No, I think that's a great distinction between demographic realities and ideological or political realities. It's something that we often make with the term multicultural as well. The only other thing that I would add, which I'm sure everyone is very aware of, that technically the term diversity refers to the heterogeneity and should not be confused with just having a lot of brown people, because there's a big difference. You know, the measure of diversity is very straightforward. The chance that someone else is going to be of a different origin. And if you have lots of white people and lots of black people, that's not very diverse because it's just two types of people. So that's another important distinction to make.
Thank you. Danny.
It's interesting because having heard what Kai had to say about this, I have a note that says distinguish between demographic diversity and the acceptance of diversity amongst the people, right? I think that's a key distinction. I think when we talk about diversity in the United States, we do think of demographic factors as being the key, right? So religion, ethnicity, race, gender, right? Sexuality, et cetera, et cetera. But I do think that one of the things that motivate my research, and I think is probably quite important in the context of Germany, is cultural diversity. As it pertains to Muslim-Christian divides, as well as ethnic diversity with regard to ethnic origins. right? So I do think that while Germany has become a diverse society, I do think there is a lot of room for improvements, to sort of borrow Kai's term of how plural German society is. It's definitely making headway, but there's a lot of work to be done on that front of like to make society in Germany and like German people a little more facilitative and receptive towards this kind of demographic shifts.
So I think that will be something that we'll return to later, I think, too, in terms of recognizing and sort of making, more kind of, plural societies, as it were. So, we know sort of from a demographic perspective, why Germany has become, more diverse, let's say, in the ways that we've been talking about it, and we can sort of see how those numbers have changed, sort of just from a statistics perspective over time. But I wonder if we can sort of point to specific, points in the last, let's say, 60 years or so, where we have seen, Germany become, sort of more diverse, whether it's based on ethnicity, whether it's based on immigration, whether it's based on, other aspects of society, right? Have there been specific points where we can point to where we've seen some of these shifts, whether and what those may be? So Kai, do you want to sort of perhaps jump in on that?
Yes, of course. I think perhaps the most interesting point in the last 2 decades was the change in the citizenship law in 2000. And with this reform, Germany took the first and perhaps most important step towards becoming a real immigration country. Until that time, people were usually German if they were descendant from parents with German citizenship. But the reform also, in the first time, granted German citizenship to children who were born in Germany and whose parents had a foreign citizenship and lived in the country for at least 8 years. So this was a very important thing, because the idea of being German was always connected to the idea of being part of a people, and you have to come from this people, and to become German when you come from another country, have another skin color or something, it was very, very, very problematic for a long time in the debate, and this changed in 2000. But it was not a perfect change in the politics, because it has some problematic regulations, like when the children come to age, they have to decide whether or not to stick with the German citizenship or to take the citizenship of their parents' home country. And this was only changed 6 years ago, that these children could have 2 different citizenships. And so these debates about citizenship were very emotional in Germany in the last 20 years, but you see there's an improvement. And I think this is that's perhaps the most obvious change on the policy level.
Mm-hmm. So Rahsaan, I wonder if you could kind of jump in on this as well. So you obviously have, sort of the legal change, but just by changing, sort of the legal standing, what sort of, effects does that have on sort of society more generally, right? By creating, sort of citizens where you may not have had citizens before, or it was harder, was that generally sort of, did that change perceptions? Did that change sort of, at the societal level, or was that very much more kind of at the legalistic level?
Well, political scientists, and I guess social scientists more broadly, like when the laws change, because that's a way of establishing the effect of citizenship. Because typically, if you just look at a country, you don't know if people who are citizens among immigrants are different from those who are not citizens, because those who wanted to become citizens were already different and wanted to be more involved, and therefore the citizenship was just a byproduct of them already having been more engaged. But in Germany, you do have that nice change in the law. Although, as Kai said, there are still some challenges that people still have to display some initiative. So I think the studies are still ongoing because of the fact that it's young people involved, and especially for some of the outcomes that political scientists are interested in, like getting elected to office and having influence, that can take a long time to build up. But I think the general consensus was, yes, that among these second and third generation Turkish origin immigrants, that their citizenship rates did increase, and that's going to have an effect in politics, because now you're eligible to vote, and so the politicians have to listen to you, and you can get elected. And you can have an influence there. And so the numbers are still rising there. They're not as high as they are in some of the other big classic countries like England, where a lot of the immigrants after World War II arrived with citizenship. So they had this, 20, 30, 40-year head start. And then France is also somewhat in the same situation. And then the Netherlands is interesting, another big immigration country, because they've had a quite high number of immigrants getting elected to their parliament. That's in part, though, because their parliament is not that difficult to get elected to, or there's a lot of turnover in their parliament. And so newcomers find it easier. But Germany is, catching up to those countries, and we'll see how it develops. This political stuff takes a long time.
So just that made me think, actually, a sort of kind of a bit of a tangent here, but just to kind of follow up on that, because you mentioned the Netherlands, right? And so the Netherlands, obviously, we know it's just generally easier to get elected, as for what you mentioned. Also, just the threshold to get elected, as we know as political scientists, is quite low. But we've also seen, a couple of very small Muslim parties develop and get elected a couple of seats, here and there in the Dutch Parliament. And I just wonder, if you see that happening in Germany. Obviously, the German party system is of course different than the Dutch party system. It's much more sort of fixed, although obviously we've seen new parties gain in strength, the Alternative for Germany party being one example of that. But is there, have you seen any evidence of that since, in the last, decade or so, now that we have, a population that is, again, able to vote, able to get elected, more so than in the past?
Well, Kai can maybe speak to this working within the parties more closely, but I would say that, you wouldn't want to be a betting person, but as you said, the combination of the party system and then also the broader societal norms, I think, in Germany are a little bit less open to that. They're not quite as closed as they are in France, where religion is a taboo in public life. But still, when you see, he's maybe an individual, but Cem Özdemir, who rises to be the top Green Party politician, he's not wearing his religion on his sleeve the way some others might. And so there's a space for these people in German politics, but it is often as Germans, with certain characteristics. And we haven't yet seen an environment where that's very open to them front-loading that Muslim or another ethnic identity as the main label, but Kai probably knows the latest.
Yeah, Kai, do you want to?
I think the problem is that the party system is very. All the parties are very conservative in their way they choose their candidates for parliament and for offices, and it took a very long time to come to the top. But as I see it, the Social Democrats and the Christian Democrats, as the big ones, especially, and the Greens, they are seeking for diverse persons in politics. So and there are more and more. So next year we've got federal elections, and there's at the moment a very interesting debate for the parliament seat in Berlin, because the young social democratic politician Rahsaan Maxwell wants to get this seat, and the current mayor of Berlin also wants it. So it's a story. A young woman from Palestine and an old white man are now running against for this seat, and so there is something happening, but it's very slow, and I think it will take a lot of time.
Mm-hmm. Is this, can I ask, in Berlin, is this, what district is this? Is this a district that is more, that has more of a heterogeneous population in the center of the city, or?
It's a very, as far as I know, it's a very traditional Western German neighborhood, but it's very difficult because many people, it's a very interesting situation at the moment. The leader of the youth organization of the Social Democrats said he won a Berlin seat for the Bundestag. Then the current mayor said he will change and will go to the Bundestag. And then this very popular young woman said, okay, I will go there. And they are now fighting for the best neighborhoods where to run for office. And that's it's an interesting debate because it's also about a young immigrant woman and an older man. So people find it very interesting to write long articles about this.
Sure. No, on many dimensions, you know, I'm sure it's very interesting in terms of what that looks like. So we have just been joined by our fourth panelist, who I'd like to bring into the conversation. Welcome, Louise. And I will, let me pause for a moment and introduce her, and then I will actually turn the question that we've been discussing, which I will give you a little bit of background over to you to join into the conversation. So I'm pleased to have Louise Davidson Schmitz join us. She is professor of political science at the University of Miami, and her research interests include gender and LGBTQ politics in long-term democracies. She's the author of Gender Quotas and Democratic Participation, Recruiting Candidates for Elective Office in Germany, very relevant to our current conversation, published by the University of Michigan Press, and was the editor of a special issue of the journal German Politics entitled Gender Intersectionality and the Executive Branch, The Case of Angela Merkel. Her recent publications include several articles on LGBTQ politics in Germany. So welcome, Louise. So we were just talking, and hopefully your audio is working well, about any points, things that we can point to in the last decades that have made Germany a more diverse society by various definitions. And we had just spent some time talking about the citizenship law change in 2000. And so I wonder if you could, from your perspective, refer to any sort of points in time where you see from a gender perspective, from an LGBTQ perspective, where you've seen perhaps any of things, things change in recent decades. And just to mention that I did preface kind of the conversation with some of the law changes, just kind of briefly going through some of those in the introduction regarding same-sex marriage and adoption and things like that, just so you know where the context is. But if you'd like to elaborate on any of those or any other points that you want to point to as well. Oh, I can't hear you. Oh, hold on. Let's see. You are unmuted, but I cannot hear you for. Let's see.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, sorry about that.
That's
I've been
okay.
I think maybe, I don't know what happened. Anyway,
Not a problem.
Thanks so much for having me here. And I apologize for being late. We're actually holding in-person classes here, so I have to come out of the classroom. So I was thinking in terms of LGBTQI politics, maybe more than gender politics, but I can probably talk about both. I thought if we're thinking about LGBTQI issues, I'm not sure what background you provided, but it's maybe good to start off with just what those letters actually refer to.
Sure.
And so if we think about LGB standing for lesbian, gay, or bisexual, T for trans, and I for intersex, we've actually seen a lot of progress and change in Germany on these issues over the course of the 21st century, or over the course of the Merkel chancellorship, which I want to take a step back and say is actually, from a political science perspective, a real surprise, right? Because we wouldn't expect, Merkel herself is from the Christian Democratic Party, which is very closely aligned with the Catholic and the Protestant churches. She herself is the daughter of a Protestant pastor. She argued in the course of the debate over marriage that she thought marriage was a contract between a man and a woman, and she voted against it. So this is not the administration where you would have expected a lot of change on LGBT issues. So in that sense, actually, a lot of what's happened in Germany is pretty surprising. And I'm not sure quite what you covered, but I would say in terms of LGBT politics, certainly marriage, the legalization of marriage in 2017 was a big change. I don't know if you talked about it, but last May, Germany banned the practice of so-called conversion therapy on minors. Conversion therapy is actually not a therapeutic practice at all. It's actually quite harmful, but it's something that seeks to convert lesbian or gay youth to being heterosexual. And Germany banned that in May. It's punishable by a 30,000 euro fine or a year in jail. And this policy was spearheaded by Jens Spahn, who's Germany's health minister, who's an openly gay man and a member of the Christian Democratic Party. If we look at intersex citizens, Germany is actually a world leader in acknowledging the existence of intersex people. So if you're not familiar with what intersex means, it's a physical condition. Generally, we think of people as being having the male or female sex. So if we think chromosomes, XX is female, XY is male, while some people are born somewhere in between. So people with Klinefelter syndrome are XXY chromosome people, for example. Historically, that's led to the practice of doctors, especially when babies are born, trying to correct them or fix them by undergoing surgeries that are oftentimes very, very damaging. And one of the reasons why doctors kind of want to operate on babies right away is because when you leave the hospital, you have to have a birth certificate or a document that says what sex you are. And if you don't fit in the male or female box, it's a problem. So in 2013, the Merkel government allowed people to basically not check a box at all in a birth certificate, to leave identity undefined. And a later court case said that's actually kind of not fair to intersex people, because it doesn't really acknowledge that they exist. It just says they're not either male or female. And so in 2018, the government changed the rule again so that there's actually a positive option you can select. So you can choose to be male, female, or diverse on your identity documents. And so Germans now have an option for a third gender, which is very unusual in the course of the world. Germany is actually one of the world leaders in this type of a policy. And if we look at that policy, it's been used by some trans people to also change their gender on identity documents. Germany also under Merkel has seen it become somewhat easier to change your sex from male to female or female to male if you're trans. It used to be the case in Germany, you needed to do 3 things to change your sex. One is if you were married, you had to get divorced, even if you loved your partner and didn't want to divorce them. In 2009, that restriction was taken away. A second thing you had to do was basically be sterilized, either have a vasectomy or a hysterectomy, again, whether or not you wanted that. In 2011, that requirement was actually struck down by the German Constitutional Court, so it's no longer enforced. And the policy now is that you need to have if you have 2 doctors say you have a problem that needs to be fixed, then you're allowed to change your sex on documents, which is kind of a problem because now most psychological associations don't see being trans as being a problem that needs to be fixed. So it's difficult for a doctor acting in good conscience to provide this kind of documentation when it goes against medical advice. And it's also costly for people to get this reports and to go through the legal proceedings. So there's some pressure on the government to change this law, but so far no changes have been made. And the final thing that I wanted to point out is that in 2011, Germany created what's called the Magnus Hirschfeld Foundation, which is a foundation that receives over €500,000 a year from the German government to do three things. One is to provide education to build LGBTI acceptance both within Germany and abroad. So they work with people all around the world. A second thing they do is to research problems that are being faced by LGBTI people, especially within an intersectional kind of a context. And they also do historical research to look into Germany's past and some past abuses of human rights in the country. And the other thing they do is to work toward memory or memorializing some of the problems of the past. And so another thing that Germany has done in recent years is to create a memorial right downtown in the center of Berlin to LGBT people who were stigmatized and killed during the Holocaust. So these are a number of advances that have been made that we wouldn't necessarily expect from a Christian Democratic chancellor. And I'm not sure if you talked about gender-related issues, but there's also been a lot of progress in terms of providing opportunities for both men and women to take care of kids and to work in the workplace, and to have women represented on corporate boards.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you so much. That's I gave a bit of kind of a background of some of these things at the beginning, but thank you for really elaborating on a lot of these. And I think it's really interesting and important to point out sort of that these were all under a conservative administration, right? Just as a reminder, of course, everyone listening has some familiarity with Germany, but Chancellor Merkel has been in office since 2005. And so when we talk about really the last 15 years of legislation, of changes to laws, et cetera, that has all been under a conservative administration, although with various different governing partners at various points during that. But I think just to situate that in that sort of that long period of time that we've had that same leader. And so thank you for putting all of that into perspective. And I think that really is important to point out that many of these things are not things that we might expect in a conservative administration. So I want to flip back over, we had talked a bit about the citizenship law back in 2000, but to talk a little bit about some of the policies and some of the things that Chancellor Merkel has implemented during her tenure relating to the integration of immigrants and things related to immigration, refugees, et cetera, those perhaps that we might have expected and perhaps maybe those that we haven't. So among the three of you, who would like to jump in and start on that? Or I can just call on someone. Does one of you want to start with some of that? Kai, perhaps I can turn to you.
Sorry, I didn't get the question you asked.
Sorry. So the question was just, what are some of perhaps the policies, the laws that have been implemented during Merkel's tenure relating to the integration of immigrants, of refugees,
Perhaps the colleagues who do more policy research have more things, of course.
I can say something.
Sure, Rahsaan, go ahead.
I mean, I think broadly put, one of the big changes, not just in Germany, but elsewhere in the aughts, if that's what we're calling them, was an increased attention on what academics call civic integration, which means that they didn't want to just give people citizenship, but they wanted to be sure that they were appropriate citizens and they had other characteristics. And so language was one. They were worried that they weren't sufficiently assimilated, and this was coming on the backs of the wave of terrorism that started to kick up, in the early 2000s, and especially in Europe in the mid-2000s, the mid-aughts. And many of those terrorists turned out to not just be foreign-born, but they're people who had been grown within Europe, and there was this whole fear that we're growing these parallel societies, is one of those terms that was thrown around, and there was this notion that if we're going to take people in, we have to make sure we're taking in the right ones above and beyond the length of time they've lived here. And so one of the big changes, was fair, there were a lot of more controversial things, and there were all kinds of tests floated in the different German states and then also elsewhere about, were people comfortable looking at people like men gay people together, or women without tops, you know, because certain German swimming areas are people are not going to wear clothes, and where these more, they're worried about the conservative Muslims. But those were often hard to get past because they, you know, quite frankly, don't make any sense. But the bigger changes that did stick were the language requirements, raising the language requirements, and then also raising requirements on bringing people from abroad. There's this concern about Muslims bringing child brides from abroad, and so raising the requirements for who can come on that front. And so that for a while was where things were shifting, and there was a lot of movement, but really language was kind of the basic common denominator that everyone could agree on. I think the conversation shifted a little bit once the refugee situation reemerged in 14, 15, and 16, and then obviously Merkel made her exceptional policy there as well. And I think there's still an ongoing debate. I mean, before the pandemic, that was the big topic, and it was, you know, how effective is it? It's too early to tell. You know, what can we do? But I think that's still an ongoing question.
Great, thank you for elaborating on that. So I want to maybe move the conversation a bit. We've been focusing on policies themselves, and we know that policies can be implemented, but that doesn't necessarily change attitudes and behaviors. We have a whole panel of political scientists here, so we all know this. But I do want to shift to kind of talking more about sort of the attitudes and the behaviors piece of this, and thinking about sort of how attitudes towards whether it's immigrant groups, whether those that may be different than oneself that we've been talking about, right? How those have changed, and to really kind of unpack what some of those are based on sort of your own research, but other research as well. Danny, do you want to start on that topic?
Yeah, so I would like to sort of flag some demographic shifts in the frequency of interaction with minority populations or immigrant communities, right? So like we know for a fact that 26% or 28%, I think, of German society has a migrant background, right? So what does that look like in sort of interactions with people of migrant backgrounds, right? So if you look at sort of public opinion data on this, you know, workplace contact, for example, so people interacting with people with migrant backgrounds since the 1980s has increased almost twofold, from 25% to 50%, right? You know, people say, like in the 1980s, people said that they interacted with migrant populations, you know, 13% of German people said that they interacted with migrant populations in their neighborhoods. Now that's at 38%. 55% of Germans today say that they have a group of friends that includes migrant populations. And almost a quarter of German people say that they have people with migrant backgrounds in their family. So these are actually like indicators that suggest there's a fair amount of sort of interaction with migrant populations that has been quite significant and dramatic over the past 30 years or so. Having said that, there are sort of movements with regard to attitudes that I would like to flag, right? So if you think about sort of the good side of this, there's been a shift in public opinion that says foreigners living in Germany should be sent home when there's not enough employment. That the agreement with that statement went from 50% to 14%. So there's generally this perception that like economic hardship of German society should not affect whether you know, foreigners should be allowed to stay. There's also a significant decline in the proportion of people who say that foreigners living in Germany should be prohibited from taking part in any political activity. That went from 50% to 20%. So these are sort of positive shifts. But there, like, in addition to these positive shifts, there are concerns about some troubling patterns, let's say. There's a persistence of this perception that refugee influx should be limited, right? So around 72% of the German population say that there should not be like an uncontrolled inflow of migrant populations from conflict-prone societies, right? There's one thing that I thought that I was really shocked when I was analyzing the data is that like around half or slightly less than half of German adults say that Turks living in Germany should have the same rights as German in all areas. Right? So there's still this sticky perception that somehow Turkish populations and minority populations in general are not entitled to the same type of rights that German native population should have, right? There's still a lot of hostility towards, or reported uncomfortableness with a member of a foreign community marrying into family. That's at 50% for Turkish populations and asylum seekers. And there's still a shockingly large number of people, a quarter of the German population, who say that foreign communities, they would be uncomfortable having members of foreign communities as their neighbors, right? So there are sort of these dual trends where I think we can sort of say that German society has become pluralistic in a sense towards foreigners, but at the same time, there's like this stickiness in public opinion as to how receptive these people, German populations are towards migrant communities. I'll stop.
No, thank you. That was all really excellent information. Kai, do you want to? I was going to call on you, but you.
One thing, we use this question about, do you like to have as a neighbor a person from a foreign country, a person with a different religion, or as well a homosexual person? And what we see is what we heard, that around 20%, 25% in Germany at the whole say we don't like it to have an immigrant as a neighbor. But if you look at this question in regard of if it is answered in Western or in Eastern Germany, you see a big difference, because in some Western states, it's about 2 to 7% of the population who said this. And if you go to some Eastern states, you find out it's about 40 or 45% of the people who said this. And you have to know that around 80 to 90% of all people with a migration background in Germany live in Western Germany. So there are no migrants in Eastern Germany, but the hostility and the rejection is on a very high level. So this is a thing which is very typical and very problematic, and you see where are the places where the right-wing populist parties, especially the Alternative für Deutschland, is successful. It's in Eastern Germany. It's in there, especially in the rural areas. And, so there's a big difference between the two parts of the country.
Kai, thank you for pointing that out. I wonder if you could just, for those that are listening that may not be as familiar with some of these patterns, why, I guess two parts to that question, why the differences between East and West in terms of the attitudes, and then also if you want, and others can of course jump in on this also, why the support for the AfD, right? So on the one hand, right, the differences between East and West, the fact that we have very few immigrants living in Eastern Germany, but yet that is where we have very high support for the right-wing Alternative for Germany party. So if you want to elaborate again, just for those that may not be as familiar.
Okay, as you said in the beginning, we are now 30 years after the reunification, and before reunification, there was no immigration to Eastern Germany. There was some immigration from Mozambique and Vietnam, but very small numbers, and they did not stay there. So the situation was there were no migrants in Eastern Germany. And then we had the situation in the first 10 years in the 90s that the economy in Eastern Germany was breaking together. So we had a great migration from East to the West, but more or less no migration from the West or from outside Germany to Eastern Germany. And so 13 years afterwards, there is, like I said, of these 20 million person with a migrant background in Germany, there are only 2 or 3 million of them living in Eastern Germany. And the situation is that with these large refugee influx in 2015, for most areas in Eastern Germany, this was the first confrontation with immigration in their life. You can go to villages and where they perhaps, it's an assumption, but perhaps saw for the first time a black person or something like that. So, this is the one story. So the possibility to have contact with an immigrant, to have contact at the workplace, at school, or in public spaces, the possibility is very low. And on the other hand, there is also the situation that many people in Eastern Germany feel that they are kind of second-class citizens after all. So Western Germany is richer, the wages are higher, and the situation in Eastern Germany in some parts is also difficult. It has become better over the years, but most people are thinking about the last 30 years in a way that a Western system was implemented without asking them, without they had something from this development. So this is the point where a party like the Alternative für Deutschland jumps in, and they do two things. They tell the people, okay, you need more recognition for what you did for this country, for your situation. And on the other hand, in Western Germany, we've got a situation of multiculturalism, and multiculturalism is a problem. We have to ensure that this will not come to our part of the country. We don't want to have a situation here like they have in Western Germany with terrorist attacks, with crime and so on. So they draw a very, very dark picture of immigration and multiculturalism. And they are successful. They were successful for the last 5 years, and now they are represented in every state parliament, and since 2017 in the Bundestag.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. That's very, very good, very helpful context. Rahsaan, I wanted to turn to you and wonder if you could talk a bit about the research that you've done, in which you look at sort of the nature of where one lives and how that may affect, attitudes, et cetera, towards immigrants and others.
Yeah, I mean, I've done a bunch of research on it because I think everyone the urban-rural divide is very visible in many countries, and it's easy to note that people who live in large cities tend to be more open to immigration, diversity, multiculturalism, and people who live in the rural areas are less open to those things. You can also overlay this with similar things like the AfD vote or the Brexit support. And so the question is there something about living in the big cities that makes people more likely to support diversity and multiculturalism? And is there something about living in the rural areas that makes people less likely to support those things? And the answer, as far as I can tell, is no. The answer is who is more likely to live those places? And you can think about that in a number of ways. One important way is that education and occupation. So we know that people who are higher educated and have professional jobs generally tend to be more open to diversity. And they also, due to the pre-pandemic economic trends, were concentrated in large cities. And so that shift has actually concentrated them in those large cities even more, over the past 2-3 decades. And so that's a big explanation of who either moves to the cities or who doesn't move. And there's also maybe some evidence of cultural preferences. So, if you want to be a lawyer, but maybe you want to be in a big city, if your cultural preferences say that you like diversity, but those effects are actually not that big because, frankly, even people who leave big cities and go to rural areas but are highly educated, those people tend to be more open to diversity, because people who move in general long distances tend to be more highly educated because they have the money to do it, the professionals. So the short answer is that, you know, if you look more closely at these geographic divides, a lot of it is less about the urban-rural aspect per se, and more about these other characteristics that predict attitudes. And also, you can also, I mean, there's more one could say if people are interested. I mean, you can also look at neighborhoods. I think there's a lot, if you want to talk about a long conversation about geography, you know, there's some evidence that your neighborhood matters. And of course, anyone who's been in a big city knows that the entire big city is not a complete bastion of multiculturalism. There are also very homogenous pockets of these large cities. And so you can observe some variation there. But again, that's partially driven by selection, meaning people don't just randomly move to different neighborhoods. And the effect of living in neighborhoods is extremely nuanced and doesn't explain these broad patterns.
Mm-hmm. No, thank you. And I think this gets to a point. Earlier on, we were talking about the election in a district in Berlin that we were talking about. And I asked, you know, is this in sort of the more kind of multicultural, you know, heterogeneous sort of Mitte part of Berlin, or is it in a different area? Just highlighting that, you know, even within, you know, a city that we generally in Germany think that is fairly multicultural. Obviously, there are different neighborhoods. We can look around our own, of course, neighborhoods where we live and know that there are very big differences, especially now in the U.S. in the current political context as well. Louise, I want to shift over to you to ask the question about attitudes as it regards the LGBTQI community, and where we see and what we know about sort of attitudes to some of these things that you talked about, and just kind of different perceptions to individuals in the German context.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, because I find the last three comments so interesting, because it's so parallel. So if we start off with Danny saying, you know, people generally are more favorable about immigration, but then when they think about, oh my gosh, what if I have an immigrant as a son-in-law, we can see the same attitude on LGBTI issues. So actually Germany, if the Pew Charitable Trust does a survey of attitudes toward homosexuality all around the world. And if we look at Germans, 86% of Germans say they have no trouble accepting homosexuality, which puts Germany among the top 4 countries worldwide in terms of that percent. So overall, Germans are very, in theory, accepting of homosexuality. If you look at the question, what if your daughter came out as a lesbian? What if you have to work with a trans person? Those percentages of people saying, I feel a little bit uncomfortable with that, tend to go up. So I think kind of a similar sort of a pattern. I was unable to find differences today about East-West differences in attitudes toward homosexuality. I can imagine going 2 different ways. If we look at Eastern Germans, they're much more secular. There was a lot of repression of the church under communism. And so people aren't probably likely to have religious objections to homosexuality in the East as much as we might find in the West, where people are more closely affiliated with the church. On the other hand, if we look at this kind of these difference between rural and urban attitudes, they map out very neatly with LGBT people. Rahsaan, I don't know if you've seen the new work by Philip Ayub and Kelly Coleman, but they're looking at what explains same-sex marriage. Well, it has to do with like urban or where do we see favorable LGBT rights in urban spaces and urban concentrations. And so there's probably some of that cultural affinity. Why would you move to the big city from the small town? Well, maybe if you don't want to marry the girl next door and you want to, you know, marry a guy, maybe you're more likely to find one in the big city than in the small town. So I would expect, and where we look at where are same-sex partnerships entered into in Germany, where do we see same-sex households, where do we see people choosing that they're going to pick that diverse category? Those are urban centers, and they're not in the more rural kind of lender. If we look at the AFD and the way the AFD plays out here, I think it's actually really interesting. This is what my research is looking at now. If we look at that 86% of Germans accepting LGBT people, that's about roughly the same percentage of people who said they would accept marriage before marriage passed in Germany. The supporters of the AFD, about 75% of AFD supporters said before same-sex marriage was legalized, same-sex marriage was okay, which is about the average for Italy as an entire country. And so there are actually a good number of people in the AFD who have relatively pro-LGBT attitudes. And so we can see this playing out if we look at the strategy that the AFD takes at the land level or the state level in terms of their electoral appeals. So one of the co-leaders of the AFD is Elisa Vidal. She's a lesbian. She's married to a woman from Sri Lanka. They're raising children. And so there's at least lesbian presence at the top of the AFD. And a lot of the appeals that they make to voters in large cities, in places like Berlin, is you should vote for the AFD because we're going to restrict immigration, and immigrants who are from Muslim countries are backward and they're homophobic. And so in order to protect gay rights, we need to vote for the AFD and stop immigration. On the other hand, the same party and people who are not Elisa Vidal in the AFD, and especially the AFD when it's trying to make appeals in rural Eastern German areas, actually campaigns on a completely opposite platform of really overt homophobia, saying we need to stop sex education in schools, we need to stop gender studies, and we need to kind of return to older, more traditional gender roles. So you should vote for the AFD because it's going to bring back the traditional nuclear family. So in a sense, the party is kind of schizophrenic internally, depending on, I think, who it's trying to appeal to and who's making the appeals. So, but I think lots of similarities here in terms of, urban educated people being more progressive perhaps than people who have less education in more rural areas.
Thank you. No, I think I think that's a really important point, that we often talk about things as they relate to specific populations, but then I think if we step back, there are a lot of similarities and commonalities that can help us to understand some broader patterns. I want to take a moment to ask, I suppose, first, and then let you all answer. We've had a few questions in the chat. And then for our audience members, if you have other questions, feel free to put them in the chat or to put them in the Q&A. And we'll be happy to ask them of our panelists. The first question, Louise, I'm gonna see if I can combine a couple of questions that were directed to you in particular. And so these are, let's see if I can sort of summarize these, but thinking about the differences between the German and the US LGBT and intersex communities. And I think the question is where they explicitly wish to be connected to each other, or in terms of separate entities. And so the individual says, my understanding is that more intersex people in the US do not consider themselves innately LGBT and do not want to be automatically connected, although obviously not a monolith. Is this different in Germany? And maybe I'll leave that. I'll let you answer that first, and then I'll get to the next question.
Okay. Yeah, no, I'm happy to address that. And I actually should have prefaced my remarks earlier in that I was putting those groups together because I'm interested in sexuality and sexual minorities and politics in general. The intersex community worldwide is kind of split. Some people argue that if we can get rid of the gender binary and we can think more queerly in general, then intersex people are going to find more acceptivity because we accept that people aren't just always this way or that way, but they could be many ways. Other intersex activists say, if you're in rural Saxony and you're an anhänger or a supporter of the AFD and you have an intersex baby, the last thing you want those parents to think is your baby's queer, right? You want to think your baby has a medical condition that needs a medical treatment or appropriate medical issues. So the community is very split. If we look at activism within Germany and where this law came from, the recognition of diverse as a gender category, the activist strategy that was followed was actually not intersex activists working with the LGBTQ community, but intersex activists working with the Deutsche Frauenbund, the women's organization in Germany. And their approach was to think about intersex rights as fitting into women's rights more broadly. Germany is a signatory to the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW. And the German government is obligated to, this is a UN convention, the German government is obligated to report to the UN what they're doing to end discrimination against women. And as part of that process, women's organizations can file what are called shadow reports or parallel reports that give their own perspective on how the government's doing. And intersex activists work together with feminist activists to put together a report, a shadow report that talked about intersex people. Part of the ways of ending discrimination against women is, for example, stopping involuntary sterilizations or involuntary surgeries on women's bodies. And so the intersex activists framed their claims as a violation of bodily integrity that women shouldn't be subject to. So, we shouldn't just take the ovaries out of babies because it looks like they have a penis. And so it was that collaboration of activism that actually drove this law forward. And I think that and if we look at the intersex organizations within Germany, they are separate standalone organizations from the LSVD, which is the largest LGBT organization in Germany. But the LSVD also claims to speak for intersex people at times. So I think some of those tensions are there.
Great, thank you. So let's see, we'll skip to a different topic completely, and if we have time, we'll get back to the other question from that audience member. So the next question, and this is to whomever would like to respond, could any of the members of the panel address the issue of unaccompanied refugee minors in Germany, primarily young men from Syria? She says social scientists have been working on employment and language, but there is still a lot of social exclusion. So in terms of social scientists, assume also sort of from a policy perspective in terms of employment and language. So if anyone wants to, it's a bit more of a comment, but if anyone wants to talk about that issue in specific to unaccompanied refugee minors or sort of integration beyond perhaps employment, language, etc. Does anyone?
Chris, I can say a couple things really quick.
Sure.
One, not on the minor part, but I think one, I think she already acknowledged that what Danny was saying, that there are multiple trends going on, and that acceptance in one realm doesn't mean that people are accepted in all realms. It's also worth noting that for some of us who study politics, that can, in many ways, in many societies, that's often one of the last areas that people, integrate, in part because it takes so long, just to get citizenship in the process, whereas it's much faster to integrate on a social level in terms of relationships. Those form, the chemistry of relationships form among people pretty quickly. And then, of course, the foods everyone knows, those travel very quickly. They're very delicious. The donor is German, but these days. But I will say also on this notion of asylum seekers, I have some research with a grad student of mine, Errol Kuhn, and we looked at, there has been a lot of work on how asylum seekers are integrating in terms of their economic outcomes. But there's been less, at least broad quantitative work on how they feel about society and their how comfortable they feel. And so we took advantage of the fact that in Germany, they are essentially randomly allocated to counties, first to the states and then to the counties. And we found that they feel most welcome in counties where there are a lot of other foreign-born people. And so that is, and we were thinking, and that's more important than the economic situation where they were sent. It's more important than the political constellation of whether the local areas voted for the AfD or voted for the Greens. More important than urban-rural divides. And so we interpret that as something about some environments are more welcoming than others, and so there's a lot of variation. But yes, I think in general there's a lot more needs to be done. In part, this is such a new population that you've really only had time. Academics work slowly, so the journalists have been out in front, and then I'm sure more and more academics will be studying these new groups more and more.
Great, thank you. We have one more question at the moment, and as I said, please feel free to add anything, comments, questions in the chat as well. So Danny, I'll direct this one to you, but then others can, of course, jump in, which is about sort of some of the data that you provided, looking at attitudes towards migrants. In some cases, these attitudes were specific towards Turkish migrants. And the question is, how much do these answers differ when comparing migrants from different countries? We think about sort of inside of the EU, for countries in the eastern part of the, eastern part of the EU, new member states, Syria, etc. So when people talk about migrants, I guess sort of as a follow-up, based on what you've, your own research too, what do they have in mind? What, and I suppose who do they have in mind when they're responding to some of the, some of the information that you provided, but also in your own research too. And then others can jump into. But yeah, go ahead, Danny.
I don't have specific numbers off the top of my head with regard to any particular group, but I thought at the time I was doing the analysis for this data that Italians would be like a weird but interesting reference category, right? Because there are generational shifts in how Germans perceive Southern Europeans, right? So if we compare some of the same items that measure sort of how comfortable you are with a member of a foreign community, for example, marrying into a family or becoming a member of your neighborhood or your community, I think it's often the case that people are much more comfortable with people, say, like Italian populations, Polish populations, and perhaps even Eastern late settlers, as people refer to them, right? So it's quite often the case that it seems, at least for us, when we're looking at the data, that a lot of this is sort of directed towards migrants from, like Turkey or the Middle East, the Levant, et cetera, that there's genuinely a clustering of responses that have very particular attitudes towards minority Muslim populations versus more European populations. Although I would say that even for Eastern European populations who have been migrating into Germany, there is still some level of skepticism amongst the German population. But there's that, and then there's also the Muslim population who seem to be facing much more hostility with regard to this.
Thank you. Anyone else want to add anything to that, Kai? Yeah.
Yeah, perhaps one thing, because it's a very interesting dynamic over the last decades, if you look at this, because we had very strong prejudice and rejections against Polish people or Russian people in the 90s. And at this time, these were the problematic groups everywhere discussed for crime and problems with integration. Then we had the situation starting with the year 2000, where we had a discussion, and it doesn't end yet, about Muslims. It's all about Muslims. And that's were first Turkish Muslims or Muslims from Turkish origin. And this changed in 2015. So then we were talking about Muslims from Syria or from Iran and Iraq. And they were the problematic Muslims, and the Turkish Muslims were the good ones. They were integrated. They were here for 40 years, and so they were more embraced. And perhaps another part of the story is the Russians, or the Russian descent, which were the most, or the focus group in the late 90s, and now part of the strongest supporters of the AfD and an anti-immigration policy, because they have a much stronger German identity than any other group. So they are protecting your kind of community, which is very traditional and with very traditional values, very strongly based on Christian values and so on. This dynamic is very interesting.
Thank you very much for that. So I want to, of course, this conversation could continue for hours, which don't worry, it will not. But I did want to, because I think you've all raised such really interesting points that we could really go down many more paths. But I'm of course aware of time, so I do want to make sure that we have time to discuss kind of the in some ways the sort of second piece of the title of this roundtable, which is inclusive communities, and how we create inclusive communities, which there's of course no, formula with a list of check marks and how we do that. But I'd like to get, based on your own research, your own experiences, how we, in general, but again, sort of we've been talking about sort of the German context and the specifics of the German context and some of those variations, whether it's East-West, rural, urban, and others that we haven't even touched on. But how do we, if we think of, this idea of sort of an inclusive community, and I'd be curious as well of, I sort of throw that term out without really defining it. So if you want to kind of give your thoughts about what an inclusive community actually is, and how that can be created, and what some of the perhaps the constraints are to doing that. So Rahsaan, I will throw it to you first, and we'll do the tour, and everyone can give.
I'll try to keep it brief because there's a lot that one could say. I think it's first worth noting that one of the big challenges for liberal democracies, including Germany and the US as well, is how, if you talk about inclusive, like, what are the limits? Like, what is in bounds and what is not in bounds? And shortly put, are we inclusive of bigots, or are we inclusive of intolerance? And so that can be applied either to these AfD voters who feel that they've been left out of mainstream society, or it can be applied to conservative Muslims who hold religious values that Germans and other Europeans feel are not to be included. And that's a huge philosophical boundaries as to because we can't just include everyone. Maybe we can include everyone, but oftentimes we have societal boundaries. But beyond that, it's a little bit beyond my expertise to say what we can do to foster inclusion. I think a lot of people would point to perspective taking and being able to understand the other side, and a lot of micro level interventions on that. But the other thing that I would like to say, and I'm sure Kai and everyone has reflections on this, the one thing that I find unique and interesting about Germany in terms of this issue is the way it balances these layers of history, because obviously it's gone through such heavy self-flagellation over World War II and treatment of Jewish people and the Nazi past. And what's interesting is the extent to which that humility still exists, and Merkel is calling on that when she's being open to the refugees. But it's interesting how that maybe doesn't always apply to all categories and all groups, and this is not to pile on Germany, because, there's so many ways in which Germany is very inclusive and tolerant, as you said, of gender and other issues. But then there are other ways that it's not. And in particular, for so long, the Turks and migration was a huge blind spot, and the willingness to be so firm in excluding them and viewing them in somehow as a separate analytical category from the inclusiveness around the horrors of Nazism is really fascinating.
Well, thank you. Yes. So, and I think it's, I think the point that you made about history, right? I think that's something that, of course, in some ways, when we talk about any society, that is kind of the elephant in the room, and perhaps more even couldn't be more so in the case of Germany. And so I think thinking about the role of history, the legacy, in thinking about where we are today and where we can go, I think is real important. Kai, do you want to jump in on this?
Yeah, not on the history, but on the question, what perhaps are the criterions for an inclusive community or so. And we had a project some years ago, and we tried to give us a definition, what we in our project want to research on. And we say, okay, an inclusive community which deals in a positive way with diversity has to guarantee equal access to opportunity for everyone, regardless of their background, needs a way to represent the interests of everyone in politics, or give a voice in politics, ensure that everyone could feel as a part of the society, as part of this community, and is recognized as a part of the community. This is not in question if you belong to this. So you can have differences and also, but your belonging is not a question. And you have actual social interaction with people from different groups. So diversity could also mean people are standing next to each other but don't talk to each other. The groups are separated in a society, and that could be very peaceful in such a society. But what we think is an inclusive community needs real, trustful, and stable interaction between different social groups. So that perhaps are, well, not perhaps, these are the criteria we gave us for our project that time ago.
So, and I don't know if you feel comfortable answering this, but I just wonder, so how do you, right? So I think the point, and this is obviously something that resonates very strongly in the US context, right? That, you know, that you can have a diverse community if you just look at demographics, but it doesn't necessarily mean that like the different groups are interacting with each other. So how do you create those social interactions? And you may not feel comfortable answering that if anyone, and I know.
Yeah, of course, there's some, perhaps some simple answers. So simple, not in following them, but the one thing is, if you want interaction, you have to provide the opportunity for interaction. So public space is important about this. So if you don't have the places where people can meet and can do something together, they don't have the opportunity to interact. It's a way how you organize your schools and your universities, and what you do in this way to bring people together. The other thing, we did a study on how mayors work on diversity and what they do, and what we found out is, yes, it's important that you make a clear commitment to diversity and demonstrate a kind of diversity leadership, so that the leaders in a society are sensitive for the different groups and are able to speak to them and to show how to act and interact with all. You could integrate different cultural traditions into your society. I was some years ago, I was in Leicester in UK, and has a big group of Hindu migrants, and they celebrate Diwali. It's the biggest Diwali festival outside India, and it's organized by the city council. It's not the Hindu community celebrates Diwali, it's Leicester celebrating Diwali. It's kind of, yes, we are doing this together for the groups, so this kind of thing, and at least a working anti-discrimination policy is helpful, I think. So that when I said, okay, you have the equal access to opportunities, to wealth, to health, to education, and so on, you have to ensure that this is happening, that you have good measures to protect people from discrimination.
Great, thank you. That I realized that was a bit, off the cuff, but I appreciate it.
It's a tough question.
It is, yeah. I think it is a very tough question, and I think it's obviously something we could continue discussing quite a lot. But I think that's something that, again, in all contexts we're thinking a lot about, right? How do you create those social interactions? And I think the points that you made, about creating, it is from a public policy perspective, right? And an urban planning perspective, and creating those public spaces and creating places for people to meet and come out of their own homes, which of course now is a bit challenging given the pandemic, but in normal times, that those spaces are created, and points about sort of schools and in the US we talk a lot about districting and who's drawn into these schools, and things like that as well. So I think there's a lot that policies really, as we know, can really shape attitudes and shape behavior. And I think we all, again, as social scientists, know this, but I think it's just becomes very clear. Okay, Danny, I want to pass it over to you to your perspective on this inclusive communities.
So the question of how to build inclusive communities is literally the $1 million question, right? And it has given like literally sleepless nights, because it's a very perplexing, sort of complicated question to think about. there's a part of me that says, oh, we could think of sort of build on the psychology literature on this and think about what are the sort of micro mechanisms that induce people to change their minds about outgroups, right? And you could think of, as Rahsaan said, perspective taking, humanizing contact, right? How do we forge common perceptions that minorities are a part of like the broader national community is like pretty important. For like one of the things that comes out of our research is that there's a heightened but like not necessarily correct sense of differences amongst Muslim minorities and German natives, right? So one of these is that, and this is perhaps, you know, a historical legacy of people forming bias and prejudices against minority populations like way back, and that sort of staying in place. But one of the things that we noticed amongst, when we look at survey data on refugee populations since 2015, for example, they're much better educated than the initial wave of Muslim minorities into Germany. They have a much higher sense of the need for egalitarian attitudes towards gender issues, right? And if you look at the German side of that, they still have this perception that Muslim minorities tend to be regressive on issues like gender, where there's significant stakes, right? So for us, we're sort of trying to think about ways to sort of eliminate that kind of prejudice or correct these misperceptions about minority communities that I think gets us closer to this idea of inclusive communities. Having said that though, I do take Rahsaan's research really serious, because if in fact, you know, the difference between rural and urban divides is it's mostly about selection and people migrating into cities, selecting into migrating into cities, and not necessarily about the nature of interactions that are happening in these cities, right? You really need to think hard about, so what are the real things that can potentially change people's minds? I think, you know, people have started thinking about sports as a common sort of thing that brings people together. There's also issues of descriptive representation. Right now, representation in Germany is primarily tokenism, right? You have that token person, perhaps representing like a majority minority district like Neukölln or Kreuzberg in Berlin, right? But like having parties step up to the plate and say, we're not just interested in sort of having that token minority on the party ticket. We want these people to become candidates regardless of where they are running for, right? And I think having sort of political sort of initiative as well as sort of the micro foundational things that policies can aim to induce is going to be really important.
Great, thank you very much for that. Louise, your thoughts on this?
All right, I'm going to go back just a second and talk about the history that we were talking about earlier, because I realized I put out this big puzzle, like Merkel's this conservative Christian Democrat, why'd she do all this stuff for LGBT communities, right? And the big portion of that is Germany being very sensitive to human rights or charges of human rights violations, right? So when the UN said you're violating intersex people's human rights, that was like an actionable item. So I think that's a really important piece of this puzzle, at least at the elite level. But I think the more tricky question that we're all trying to get at, right, is at the societal level, and how do you build inclusive communities closer to home? And I think here we can learn some really good lessons or some informative lessons from the LGBT community, to the degree that sexuality works like race. And one of my big things is I'm trying to figure out whether race and ethnicity and sexuality are similar or different, or in what ways. But what we can see very clearly is that LGBT visibility, especially what gets referred to as interpersonal visibility, has been really vital in pushing LGBT rights forward. So when people know somebody who's gay or who's a lesbian, it really changes a lot of their attitudes and their behavior. So these interpersonal interactions where people get to know somebody really change minds a lot. So Andor Reynolds has some really interesting research that looks around the world, and where you have even just one openly LGBT legislator, or in races where just one openly LGBT candidate ran for office, we see gains in LGBT rights in policy outcomes. So it's really difficult to make hateful policies against somebody who's sitting in the chair next to you that you know. And we can see some evidence of this in the United States. There's a really interesting study about judges in US district courts where the judge is alone in his or her courtroom, but there are other judges on the hallway also in different courtrooms. And where you have at least one African-American judge in that courthouse, white judges, when they sentence African-Americans and sentence white Americans, the discrepancy in the sentencing narrows. They treat white and Black defendants more equally, just knowing that there's an African-American judge down the hall. So I think part of this is really proximity and building interpersonal relations. And that's where I think the countryside is hard. If there's not a very diverse population in the countryside, how are you going to meet and get to know these people? And I think one of the most clever initiatives that I've seen coming out of Germany in the wake of the refugee crisis, there was a program where if there were extra tickets left to a sporting event or a cultural event or a music event, people could get the tickets for free if they went with a refugee or a migrant. So if a German took somebody who was different from them to the concert or to the sporting event, they could go for free. And I think it's those kind of interactions that really drive things forward. And so that way, I really think part of this is generational. And I have a 13-year-old German citizen son, and he went to summer camp in Germany this summer, and the people he went to summer camp with were a lot more diverse probably than the people that my husband went to at summer camp in Germany in the 1960s when he was growing up, right? So I think part of this is going to be people who actually live in a diverse society are going to be more open to living to one than older people maybe who've lived in a more isolated context.
Well, thank you. I think that's a positive note that we can end on. Of course, there's lots more that we could discuss, but thank you to all of you for a really insightful conversation, and I think in some ways raised many more questions than we answered, which I always tell my students is the marker of a good class, that you leave with more questions than you came in with. But thank you for your insights as well. And I think you've given, as I said, us all lots to think about. I apologize, there were a couple of questions in the chat we didn't quite get to, but hopefully there were elements in the last comments that addressed some of those things. And I want to thank our audience members as well today. There is a survey that we would ask of you to quickly fill out for our audience members after you leave today, and my colleague Iris chat. It will just help us get some information from you. It shouldn't take more than a few minutes, so if you wouldn't mind doing that. Thank you again all for joining us today, and hope to see you at future conversations. Have a good afternoon.
Thanks, you too.
Thank you for having me.